Hello, everybody. It's great to have you all here, and welcome to this exclusive live webinar on the Ukraine war and the impact on Asia. I'm your host for today. I'm Michael Peel. I'm the executive editor of Nikkei Asia, and it's my great pleasure to gather three very distinguished panelists here today, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first of all, what are we going to talk about? Well, what it seems everyone is talking about at the moment, which is Russia's 24th of February invasion of Ukraine and the many consequences that this has sent around the world. It's sent shockwaves everywhere, and some of the biggest are in Asia. So it's the conflict and the Western-led sanctions that have followed and been followed by some other countries have disrupted areas of the economy around the world, from food to semiconductors to construction materials. And Asian governments and companies face big decisions about how to deal with Russia and how to deal with the alliance against Russia in the aftermath of this conflict, which of course is still very much going on, and whether to support, in particular, the many countermeasures that have been launched against the Russian government. If you're watching us on Zoom, please send your questions via the Q&A function. If you're watching us via YouTube, then please submit your questions via the Google form link posted by my colleagues earlier. And we really want to involve you, the viewers, as much as possible. We're very grateful to you for joining us. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our very distinguished panel today. First up, we have Rahma Chelani, who is a professor of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research in India. Rahma, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And then we have, Hong Le Tu, who is a senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And welcome, Hong.
Thank you for having me.
And last but very much not least, we have on the economic side, Jing Nguyen, who is at the investment and wider bank Natixis, where she is the senior economist for emerging Asia. So welcome, Jing.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great. It's great to have you all. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off to get a few sort of broad, big picture comments from the panelists on how they see what has happened so far and what is likely to happen. And Brahma, perhaps we could start with you. What do you see as the main themes when we think about the impacts of the war in Ukraine on Asia and relations of Asian countries with Russia, the US, and the rest of the world?
Michael, I believe that the present crisis carries significant geopolitical and geoeconomic ramifications. And those ramifications are likely to reshape our world. The year 2022 will go down in history as marking the start of a new Cold War. The first Cold War began with the Korea War, and the second Cold War has started with the Ukraine War. The second Cold War pits the Sino-Russian axis against the Western alliance. One question that arises is whether the second Cold War will also center on proxy conflicts. Ukraine itself is a proxy conflict, especially for the West, because the West is not directly involved in the war, but it's very much supporting the Ukrainian forces. Proxy conflicts were one of the key defining features of the first Cold War. If the answer to that question is yes, then Taiwan risks becoming the scene of a deadly proxy conflict, a proxy conflict that could destabilize East Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region. We all know that the Ukraine war directly impinges on European security, but as Michael referred to it, that the Indo-Pacific region, especially Asia, is likely to bear the greatest impact of the Ukraine war's geopolitical fallout. The Indo-Pacific region is the world's new economic and geopolitical hub. The Indo-Pacific will shape the new world order, and a greater volatility in this region seems almost inevitable as a result of the deepening international crisis over the Russian invasion. One question that looms large, at least in my mind, is will the US finally pivot to Asia? Because 3 successive American presidents have promised to shift America's primary strategic focus to Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region. But first, Barack Obama failed to genuinely pivot to Asia. Then his successor, Donald Trump, unveiled his free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, but there was no genuine shift to the Indo-Pacific. And now we have Biden, just last month, unveiled his Indo-Pacific strategy. But the US is now pouring military resources into Europe. And that begs the question whether Biden, like Obama and Trump, could also fail to genuinely pivot to Asia. And if he fails, that could open greater strategic space for China, whose expansionism already extends from the South China Sea and the East China Sea to the Himalayas. So those are my opening comments, Michael.
Thank you very much, and a great deal to think about and come back on there, and that really sets up a great framing for the conversation. Thank you, Brahma. Huang Lietu, I wonder if I could turn to you now, please. I mean, what's very noticeable and what you indeed have written about very persuasively is the variety of responses that we see across Asian countries to the war. What are the most important reactions you see from both individual countries and regional groupings in Asia?
Thank you, Michael. I think a lot of discussion has been on big powers, whether it's China, as Rama mentioned, or US and their role. And those are very important questions, but there are all others, a group of others in the international community, including the group of Southeast Asian countries, for example, that I've written about, and the group that is called under the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. And I think the reaction there is quite various, as you mentioned, and is dictated by their national interests and their positions. So I would summarize around 1 month after the attack of Russia on Ukraine that there are few takeaways. One is that the countries, the middle-sized and smaller countries, they come to realization, very brutal realization that peace dividend era is over, and what comes with that begs the question of the defense arrangement, the usefulness and reliability of the concept of extended deterrence of those who have such arrangement, for example, in the form of alliances, and there are those that don't have as well, right? It certainly invokes fear and anxiety and some dangerous analogies. Some of them Brahma mentioned about potentially of Taiwan, but also South China Sea, where claimants are also quite vulnerable, and the tension had been growing for a number of years. Some of the claimants, for example, don't have that security assurance, such as Vietnam, that don't have an active treaty alliance. The question also will come depending how long this war will last, about, if it does protract, and it does continue to be a longer, slow, protracted one, what does it do to their deterrence concept, the deterrence understanding, the defense and procurement? Some of them rely heavily on Russia's arms industry, including Vietnam, but also India, which is not in ASEAN per se, but also is in that basket. And that also shapes their response. It also goes to the question of, we've been talking about the changing world order, whereas about the like-mindedness, a coalition of willing, or even pitching the competition of systems, democracies versus autocracies. This conflict shows that it's not necessarily the case, right? India is one example of that, but a number of Southeast Asian countries also, whether they are in democracies, for example, like Indonesia, are not necessarily signing automatically with the views that are of those in the West. So it's not such a straightforward division. It's really depending on the individual situations and national interests. And some have taken more of international law and order approach, like Singapore, very much principled, applied sanctions and invoke really on upholding international law, and Russia's attack on Ukraine is something that a country like Singapore cannot accept, right? And then, of course, there are issues that we still are grasping. And there's a range, of course, of bystanders who think of themselves as too small or too far away or too insignificant to make changes in this balance. And of course, there will be ongoing questions about the economic sanctions and the role of private companies, which I know Chin is going into in the more depth. But there are also rules and norms that are being shaped during this war, whether the rules of war are being followed. The new domain of war, which is cyber warfare, that is, and countries even secure and even using principled approach like Singapore are not immune to also all kind of cyber warfare tactics and information warfare as well. And I'm happy to go into depth into discussion about the whole range of that, but I would just end up, and maybe a nice segue to what Chin would be talking about, that if you look at so far the global map of those countries that have applied sanctions and those that have not, it's heavily really in the global north that has applied sanctions, which reminds us that economic sanctions is really a tool of disposal for the global north rather than global south. And in Asia, it's a lot still of developing Asia that probably wouldn't have that political will to enact, but also the capacity to do that too. So I'll stop here, and then I'm waiting for the discussion part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huang. And yeah, a lot of really interesting points there. And I would perhaps pick out a couple. One is the way that you said that this is much more complicated than a Democrats versus autocrats competition, which of course is how President Biden has tried to sort of split up the world according to the US, but it is much more complicated than that. And also the question of international opposition to Russia's actions, and while there is a lot of it, as you point out, that there are also a lot of countries that, including in Asia, that are not openly opposed to what Russia has done and are looking to their own interests and have adopted a variety of positions. So much to discuss there. Thank you. And Qing Nguyen, if we could come to you, the economic fallout from this war has already been huge. Would you please outline for us what you think are the most important dimensions of this fallout and how might they evolve from here?
Well, first, I think in order for us to really assess it, we need to understand the duration and escalation. So obviously there are quite a few views, but I'll just talk about the short term and maybe also medium term implications. The short term is, as you saw in the commodity market, it's gone berserk, particularly in the commodities where Russia and Ukraine are key. Obviously, that's oil and gas is above more than 50% year to date after a very hot year in 2021 already. Whether it's nickels or aluminum, that's already up quite substantially. And if you look at agriculture, wheat has gone up quite substantially. And the oil and gas is a key component to many products, to economic activities such as fertilizer. So as a result, we're going to see much higher costs. And what's that happening in the region? It means that we, as a net importer of commodities and fuels, will face a huge higher cost, right? China is the largest, but not just China. India is the third largest in oil, and Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, you name it. There are only 3 countries where are net exporters: Australia, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So we can't talk about winners here because as a net, we're basically losers. And so a few winners, but many, many losers. And so the next question you have to ask is then, who is going to bear this cost? Because it has political consequences, right? Because as a country, you have to pay higher import bills, But governments can choose to subsidize. Do you have the space to do so? India is doing a huge infrastructure push, and India is already having a hard time financing it. So now it has to face this huge import bill. So India, the question many people ask, why is it buying discounted Russian oil, has to come with the consideration that it's a huge impact for India beyond just security and other reasons. And then also other countries like Japan, which it can afford, right? Even though the yen is going berserk, but it can afford so. But not so much Thailand. After 2 years of very heavily no tourism revenue, it has to pay for higher oil. So we feel this across the region indirectly through the supply chains. And obviously, as you know, not just on an agri-macro picture, but countries like South Korea now have to think, well, we depend on Russia for nickel, and then there's neon gas and all these other areas, and we depend on very few countries. So it becomes a security issue for them because we have to secure the very thing that we earn income to then afford a living. So I think it's increasingly shifting also the power, which traditionally is seen as a we should have an East Asia growth model where you only manufacture things to grow, like Vietnam as a superstar of the Southeast Asia story. The shift towards perhaps Indonesia has something going on, and then what it does have is this hold in this value chain, whether it's nickel or other areas, where it can actually use it as a leverage, and then that has a huge leverage for the region. So I would say in the short term, it is a huge shock for the commodity, and that has in the medium term a huge implication for supply chain, right, for the region. That means that more bargaining power for commodity players. It also means that you have to think about how to diversify your supply chains, and that has implications in, I think, also a positive way for Southeast Asia. And when you think beyond, as what was already mentioned, that if it's conflict, the sanctions impacting not just the commodity market, but also China, potentially spilling over. Today, we heard that the export controls on semiconductor will be implemented at the allies level to impact China. So even if it doesn't directly sanction China, indirectly impact China, and indirectly having a very negative, essentially, impact on the relationship with the West and China vis-a-vis Russia and China alliance, then that means that actually as a hedge to that, even if we may have conflicts in the region, as a hedge that Southeast Asia can rise, or even India as a way to position itself, not just the West investing more in those regions, but China itself to avoid, right, the fact that it sees in the future that this is an escalated conflict. Moreover, China itself needing more allies, right? I was just attending another conference where China has just upgraded strategic relationship with Southeast Asia. That has many reasons why it's doing that, and I think that has an implication. And another medium-term implication beyond these shocks that we think, which creates losers and winners in the short terms on the FX market and equities market and etc., is really the idea of beyond supply chain is really energy security, right? What is very true in Europe is that it in the short term, because the supply inelasticity of gas, given the 40% dependence on Russia, and Putin just say he wants rubles, right? So he thinks he has so much bargaining power because that, and then the only way Europe in the short term to do this is by shifting its demand, basically lowering it to match to really avoid this, is that in Asia, because we're such a net importer of energy, how are we going to achieve this energy security? How are we going to achieve a cleaner target while at the same time without eroding our huge, profit margins with costs going so high? And that answer has to be, we need to do the green energy transition, but at the same time, we need to diversify our sources. So that is a big question for the region, and it brings back this sector is a huge the energy sector is a huge sector because that underpins the global economy, and that is an economic and a security issue, and I think that is a long-term implication for the region.
Great, thank you very much, and many things to come back on there. And one thing that is attracting a lot of interest already, and I think is a fascinating question that you touched on is, what difference does this make to the idea of the Asian century economically, and there's the possible shortage of inputs or vastly more expensive inputs. So let's perhaps come back to that in a moment. But another thing you mentioned, which I'd like to throw in, and perhaps Rahma, I could ask you about this first, is there's also a lot of interest from the audience, is the position of India, which pulls together a lot of the points that have been raised so far. India has a very complex balancing act here. It has to consider its relations with Russia, obviously, but also China and the US. And plus, as Jing said, it has this enormous need for inputs for its infrastructure drive and the rest of its economy. How do you see India's balancing act at the moment, and how do you see that playing out, and what will be the wider implications in India, for Asia, of that?
Well, it's not just a balancing act, it's also being driven by India's security and economic dilemmas getting more accentuated by the present crisis. And people in the world talk about Russia's aggression, its invasion of Ukraine, but how many people in the world are aware of the fact that India currently is facing Chinese aggression, that there are about 200,000 Indian troops tied down along the Himalayas seeking to fend off a Chinese border aggression, and that Chinese border aggression began nearly 2 years ago in May 2020. And in fact, no Western leader has urged China to pull back its forces from the India border. China has massed large numbers of troops along the India frontier in breach of binding bilateral accords with India. So the irony is that the same Western leaders expect India to side with the West in the new Cold War against Russia, but they won't open their mouth on the Chinese aggression that India is confronting. So India has to balance its approach in a way that preserves its interests. And the fact that India is a major importer of commodities, of energy, makes India's dilemma quite difficult. So given those realities, India is trying to play a very careful role. It has openly called for an end to hostilities without naming Russia. It has asked Russia to end its military operations in Ukraine. It is on the same page as the West in terms of protecting Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and integrity, but it is hesitant to condemn Russia for the sake of condemning Russia, because the Soviet Union in the early 1970s played a very helpful role in preventing China from attacking India when India was instrumental in the independence of Bangladesh. In that war, there was a real danger that China would intervene because the Nixon administration, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were egging on China to militarily attack India. But the Soviet Union, by signing a friendship treaty with India, played the role of a deterrent to a Chinese attack against India. So India realizes that even though Western policy has driven Russia today closer to China, that the Russians, at the end of the day, have concerns about China, concerns that they share with India, because after all, Russia is the world's wealthiest country in terms of natural resources. And next to Russia is China, which is resource hungry. And the big threat to the Russian Far East comes from the demographic invasion of Chinese So despite the Western policy, which has unwittingly pushed Russia closer to China, Russian policymakers are concerned about the security threat that Russia faces from China. So given the China factor, India does not want to burn its bridges with Moscow. That's the prime consideration driving India's current posture.
Thank you, Brahma. Huang, could I bring you in here and just to get your response to Brahma's framing? Do you see it in a similar way? And perhaps to expand a little bit to consider what you talked about earlier, which is the position of Southeast Asian nations, which are very used to these complex balancing acts in their relations with China. And now this has made it even more kind of acute, even more painful, perhaps for many of them. I mean, how do you see those tensions working out, and what kind of alliances do we think will emerge from this?
Yeah, I think for the considerations that India has can be resonated among a number of capitals in Southeast Asia as well, because a lot of countries in the region have good relationship with Russia traditionally, and similarly, for example, Vietnam heavily relies on Russia's defense and arms supply, and of course, the main security concern of Vietnam, for example, is China and South China Sea. And so it is in a very peculiar situation, and I should mention also that Vietnam has two comprehensive strategic partners, which is the highest level of partnership, and one of China and another is Russia. But at the same time, historically, having experienced the invasion of much larger power and having gone through the decades of war, I think a lot of people sympathize with Ukraine, even though the official position is not taking nobody's sides and is neutral. So I think it's a big dilemma for countries like Vietnam, who have real security challenge in the front of China, but also needs to speak up when international law is broken, and in this case it is, isn't it? And similarly, I think there are, even though I do caution about making automatic analogies to the attack in this region, I think there are a lot of hard thinking within the region, even though they want to perceive the neutrality and taking nobody's sides. I think defense is one thing, but also what the first line of defense for this group in Southeast Asia has been diplomacy, right? Hedging and having good relationship with external actors, including Russia has played a role in partnering with oil and gas exploration in the South China Sea, something that China is extensively challenging the regional countries, right? But also increasingly challenging their conduct as a diplomatic actors, because diplomacy is something that this group always resolved to first. ASEAN and ASEAN forums, but this year beyond ASEAN as well, because Indonesia chairs G20, Thailand chairs APEC, and Cambodia will chair ASEAN and East Asia Summit. So ultimately, I think sooner or later, and to a different variety of degrees, they will be pressured. Already we know that for G20, the European countries and of course US are pressuring to disinvite Russia, for example, not to include Russia. Indonesia is in a hard position as a big democracy. But what would Thailand and Cambodia do as a chair of APEC and East Asia Summit, for example? Those are questions that that are also challenging the diplomatic conduct, right? In terms of alliances, I think it can go either way, really, Michael. I think in Southeast Asia, there are only two treaty allies of the US, Thailand and the Philippines. Thailand has been increasingly distant from US and have taken quite quiet, if not passive approach. in the Philippines, we could hear all kind of views, including, President Duterte saying that it might escalate, and in that case, he will stand his commitment to the US. But at the same time, remember, this is the height of elections and questions of US relations, of alliance, of relationship with China, and of course South China Sea dispute, as well as general securitization, becomes a very volatile issue during the election time. So it can go really different ways. For Vietnam, I think they will stand ground of being not aligning to anyone. That's in their defense doctrine. But I can assure you that even though they're not very vocal, they are watching. All Southeast Asian countries are watching very, very closely what is happening, because, as Rama said, it will affect their security and well-being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And let's turn back to the economics again. And I'd like to pick up to a question that's come from the audience, Jing, to you, which is how can China avoid the collateral and secondary impacts of Western sanctions on Russia? And then perhaps if I could add to that a wider question, which is a tough one to answer now, I know, but who are ultimately going to be the countries who are going to be under most pressure economically because of this? And conversely, who are the countries who might benefit? Because there are many problems that you've outlined yourself, in the possibility of higher inputs, possibility of falling demand, higher cost of living in many Asian countries, which we've been writing about in Nikkei Asia recently. But then again, perhaps there are opportunities for countries in Asia to move into gaps now vacated by some Western companies. How does it all shake out, do you see? And what is the, to go back to the original question, how can China avoid the collateral impact of sanctions?
Sure, I'll start with the easier one, which is the second question. And I think it really depends on how long this will last. So I would say that in the short term, it's very difficult, for example, for Thailand, just because it's coming from very difficult 2 years to start with missing tourism, which is quite double digits to its economy, particularly with China missing Chinese tourists. And now you have higher oil. That would have a huge impact on Thailand in the short term. So if oil prices don't stay long, for example, if we are able to secure supply, in the short term, that's not going to happen likely in 2022, but in 2023, if the supply dynamic improve, then perhaps we can, that may be just a short-term shock for Thailand. And also, second thing is that Thailand has options, right? What are the levers that it's doing? It's basically doing everything it can. It's throwing out all the playbooks of pandemic, right? It's opening borders, doing everything it can to get extra income. So it's trying to diversify and getting more. And I think it's going to, if anything, the Russian-Ukraine crisis killed COVID, right? Let's talk about the news cycle. It's gone, except for zero COVID in Hong Kong and in China. Really, this is a much more pressing issue. So as a result, I think at the very least that we can have the normalization, we can move on from this in the rest of Asia. I think a country like India has challenges in funding, but at the same time, it's built up substantial external balance. And secondly, it's getting the benefit of investment. If you look at Japan has unveiled a lot of investment strategically into India, and India is doing whatever it can to attract flows. So it's getting offsetting factors. So I would say in the short term, a few countries are having a bit of a harder time. It's Thailand, the Philippines. I would say that, even though asset movements are much more volatile on the FX side for Japan, I think on an aggregate level, I think the Philippines faces a lot, Thailand faces a lot of pressure. China too, it's not entirely positive, right? Higher commodity prices is a huge challenge for China. Even if it is able to secure, and it is doing gently. So this is to segue into that other question: is that it's buying Russian oil on unlike India, who announces everything. Russia does it in a gentle way. China does it in a gentle way. And can China avoid the sanctions hitting it? And it's doing everything it can, right? It overtly criticizes the U.S. and its role in antagonizing Russia. At the same time, It's also trying to avoid it. I don't think it can. We would not have sanctions directly on China, but I think it would have indirectly. So I think that China, I think for the most part, will face worsening relationships with the West, but the West is also not in its interest to sanction China, right? Look at the trade relationship; it's too large. At the same time, we already have supply shocks from China's zero COVID, which does this targeted lockdowns, and that in itself already stoked inflation, causing President Biden to reverse a lot of its oil policy. So I think for the most part, China will get away with it. And I think the conclusion is that in the medium term, if it plays its cards right, in the medium term, it will face worsening relationships. So more of the supply chain diversification over the longer term. So that's a medium term implication. And the winners, in my opinion, should we don't have an outright war in Asia, it could potentially, if the Southeast Asian countries and potentially even India, in my opinion, India can come out a huge player in the region. And it's the right time for Modi to do a lot of development needs because it's getting the geopolitical support. A lot of these smaller countries are getting geopolitical support. We haven't talked about South Korea, but South Korea just got a new elected president, and he's tilting towards the U.S. But that balancing between the U.S. and China is quite important. But South Korea balancing act will require it to diversify the supply chain away from too much dependency on China and to hedge this medium-term risk that was already materialized under President Trump, the U.S.-China trade war. So I think the longer-term implication is that we're going to have some winners. And even if in the short terms, it seems like emerging Asia is a big loser from oil, except for Indonesia and Malaysia. So we're going to have winners is coming from capital allocation. Right. One is very, very clearly portfolio passive flows. Once you remove India, you're going to have more weight for the other countries. So that's just more. But on the longer term, FDI, that's a big one, right? Japan, for example, is doing a huge push to make India happen. Everyone wants India to be a successful story because what's a better way to hedge China than to create economic champions, right? To make its neighbors stronger. And I think that those are the winners, and those that position themselves well to leverage not just U.S., Russia, China, but also other powers and the medium-sized powers that are very important in investment. South Korea, Singapore, Japan, etc., etc. And of course, the EU. We don't talk about the EU, right? The EU is making headway. So look, Thailand is a good example, and perhaps I will end there. Thailand is a good example. Is that after the coup, the West really thumbs down on Thailand for obvious reasons, right? And what happened because of the U.S.-China trade war, and also increasingly now, if you look at the future, if there's a fragmented future, the EU needs more friends as well. And so it's actually talking to Thailand, and Thailand's talking to the EU. Thailand's talking to India. It wants Indian tourists, right? So everyone's talking to everyone because we need more friends in a fragmented world. In a multipolar world, we need more friends. And I think those smaller countries actually have a lot more to offer because they can be a gateway to, they are a hedge. A good example is Vietnam. Vietnam has the EU FTA. Does Vietnam deserve an EU FTA? Is it a market economy? Who knows? Obviously that is debatable, but it got it, right? Is China ever going to get an EU FTA? No, right? For obvious reason. And so Vietnam isn't just a someone who needs a needy help. It can actually be a gateway for China to enter the EU, right? So I would say that if you look beyond the short term of oil and commodity shocks, capital is actually where the future is, and then the future can find its home in places that are not in the crossfire and actually provide shelter for the crossfire, right?
China has loomed large. Thank you, Jing, in that conversation and in your remarks. And I suppose the question it raises is you have the economics, but you also have the dependence on a stable security situation in the region as well. And let's talk a little bit more about China in that context. A question that has been on many people's lips and indeed the audience questions that I'm seeing is what will be the impact of the Ukraine war on the dynamic between China and Taiwan? And Huang, if I could ask you that question, but also a wider question, which is, as the conversation so far has shown, there are all kinds of security tensions across Asia, from the India-China border tensions that Brahma talked about to the various island and maritime disputes around Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, some of them with multiple parties, multiple claimants, China the common factor, of course. How does that all shake out? How worried are you that one of the impacts of this Ukraine war could be to damage the security situation in Asia by a series of knock-on political and economic effects?
Yeah, I think that goes to my first point when I opened with the remarks that the peace dividend era is over. I think in the region or internationally, smaller countries, smaller mid-sized countries, we're counting on big and powerful guys to apply self-restraint and to act responsibly and to follow international law. And that was, of course, their own investing in their own defense and network of diplomacy and whatnot. But, one of the key things is to count on the big guys to act responsibly, right? And what this war has showed that, big guy like Russia did not and does not follow international law and does not care about international reputation anymore anyway. So there are serious worries, of course, and it's no longer in the realm of debate and discussion, right? Whether it's academic, whether it's public discussion, or even policy world, where some political figures in a number of countries have drummed on the drums of war already, including in Australia, for example, warning that war is not and no longer an inconceivable reality, and reminding us that we might not be interested in war, but the war is interested in us. And I think that what happened in Ukraine is a reminder and builds to that rhetoric, especially, and some of that has been used to securitization and more defense kind of foreign policy as well. From what I know in Taiwan, I think there is palatable concern, of course, but there's no direct crisis mode or panic just yet, because China itself said that it's a different situation, because China said Ukraine is an independent country, whereas China considered Taiwan as a part of China, so it doesn't want that comparison itself, right? But I think also there is legitimate argument that invasions are not necessarily contagious. Having said that, though, I do think China has in the past been an act opportunistically, and it is not also to discount at this time around. It won't act upon when opportunity presents itself. But more importantly, I think this reaction of the international community, of the world, not only of the West, but of the world itself. So the sanctions this time, as we discussed extensively, had been really heavy. I think perhaps even beyond expectations of many. So China also observes and takes notes and prepared itself for such eventuality, right? Whether it will be able to sustain for long term, and prepared its circular economy and prepared to be completely independent should it decide to attack, and should it be treated with the same round of sanction, and possibly even stronger, given that the whole West or the US is gearing towards that, right? It's not in the US has said it will not react directly in Europe, because it wants Indo-Pacific to be razor focused on China, right? So it's saving its energy for China in that regard. But I think diplomatically as well, I think Russia is being isolated. I mentioned earlier the multilateral fora that increasingly have a pressure to not include Russia. And then beyond the economic cost, there is also the diplomatic cost. So I think at the moment, it's probably too soon to rush into conclusions that China will or will not in how many months or years ahead, but certainly that probability have increased and discussion on that and preparations towards that, including defense spending of a number of countries, including considerations in Japan, in Germany, countries that have resisted for a long time, or even countries that have been traditionally neutral, like Switzerland or even Singapore, have applied sanctions. So it has changed calculus for everyone, and everyone is preparing for the worst things to come, I think.
Thank you very much, and a couple of very interesting sound bites there. The peace dividend era is over, and invasions are not necessarily contagious. So food for thought there. Brahma, I wonder if I could turn to you and pick up on a couple of things. One is something that Huang said, which is that Russia is becoming more diplomatically isolated. I wondered if you agreed with that, or whether the picture is more that Russia is becoming a pariah in some parts of the world, mainly the US and Europe. But in fact, there are enough countries that are either neutral or indeed supportive of the Kremlin that it isn't going to suffer total isolation, and that we are going to end up with this very fragmented picture around the world. And then the other question was to follow up on whether the Ukraine war creates a direct risk of direct or proxy conflicts in Asia over Taiwan or elsewhere, in your opinion?
Those are two great questions, Michael. On the first, if you look at the number of countries that voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution on March 2nd, which deplored Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 141 countries voted in favor. But the 1/4 of the countries that did not support that resolution, those 1/4 of the countries represent more than 2/3 of the global population. So in terms of number of countries, yes, the vast majority of countries have deplored Russia's aggression. But the vast majority of humanity has either taken a neutral or nuanced position on the Russian invasion. So it depends on, whether you want to look at the number of countries or look at the proportion of the global population, or another, at the global GDP. Countries that are wealthy, clearly much of the world's GDP, GDP has arrayed against Russia's invasion. But to come to the larger issue, and I think it's very important to remember one thing, which is that China dwarfs Russia in economic power and military spending. And while Russia's ambitions are restricted in its own neighborhood, China is seeking to supplant the US as the global hegemon. And the new Cold War will constrain and overstretch US from effectively countering the challenge to its global preeminence from China. In fact, the present crisis could open the path for China to accelerate its rise. China's gain will be at America's expense. So this American focus now on Russia could be detrimental to America's long-term interests. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that sanctions are a form of war, not an alternative to it. And to make the sanctions bite, those that impose the sanctions also have to bear the costs, because sanctions impose costs on the imposers. But more importantly, sanctions have unintended consequences. And those unintended consequences are difficult to foresee. If you look back in history as to, if, for example, the US sanctions on Japan, starting from the late 1930s, that led to Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor led to the Pacific War. The Pacific War eventually led to the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We are already seeing the beginning of a cycle of sanctions, counter-sanctions, and escalation. Just this week, Russia slapped counter-sanctions on Japan. And this cycle that's just beginning greatly increases the risk of military conflict, but also, more importantly, the risk that we will see international politics getting more polarized, and we might even see the global economy getting bifurcated. Huang mentioned about China's concern that it shouldn't face similar sanctions in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That clearly is President Xi Jinping's primary focus. His focus is likely to be toward neutralizing similar Western sanctions against China in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And President Xi is expected to fast-track progress on parallel international financial arrangements that are free from Western domination and from Western weaponization, whether it's the payment system, whether it's trade finance, whether it's credit rating services. China's priority is likely to be to create parallel international financial arrangements. This is just one example of how sanctions tend to have unintended consequences and can even have a boomerang effect. This is not, what the imposers of the sanctions had in mind when they began this full-fledged economic war against Russia. But this economic war against Russia is likely to bring about profound changes in the global economy, especially in the financial architecture.
Thank you, Brahma. And I think this dovetails the politics and the economics of this, the way you framed the impact of sanctions. And clearly it's very true that there can be all kinds of unintended consequences. And Qing, I'm going to ask you about those in a moment. But we've only got a few minutes left. And after this, I'd like to come back to the panelists just to ask a final question, which I'm going to float now, so you have a few minutes to think about it, which will be, what do you think, if you had to pick out a single impact of the Ukraine war on Asia that is the most important and most profound, what would it be? So that's the question I'm going to come back to you with in a few minutes. Before then, Qing, the impact of sanctions, unintended consequences. Now, this is a very difficult thing to obviously predict, precisely because the consequences were not predicted and were not intended. But you have your eyes very closely on the machinery of the economies of Asia. Are there effects that you think haven't really been picked up on yet, but which are going to become very obvious economically knock-on effects of these sanctions? And if so, what are they?
Well, obviously the sanctions are to cut off Russia from the financial system, and though in fact they purposely designed to avoid the energy sector, because of but at the same time it still has a result of people deterring from financing Russian-related assets, right? So that in itself will force Russia, as mentioned, will force Russia and China to create gateway to do it differently, right? So a good example is like today, Russia asking for ruble in exchange. So the question is then, how are we going to come up with rubles? In a way, it's trying to prop up its own currency, using the leverage of the fact that in the short term, in the elasticity of supply. And I think that as a result, you'll have more, countries asking for financing of trade other than the dollar and its currency, and whether or not it can do so, it's a question. But certainly, you can have already bilateral relationships between Russia and China, for example, or China asking the Saudis to finance an oil in Iran. And so that's one of the consequences. And in fact, but the question we have to ask then is, if sanctions aren't a tool, what are the tools, right, as a deterrent? And what are the tools the West would have? Because clearly, we have to ask if Russia's invasion of Ukraine, would it stop there, or would it go on to the doorsteps of Europe? So I think that's a bigger question, and I think it's very difficult to know, but we're clearly heading there. So a world of that is going to be increasingly segmented. It's very clear the messages coming out from China is trying to do so, trying to create the systems, and I would say in an orderly way, in a diplomatic way. Is a prefer way versus a full-out war. So the war is not fought, I think, in terms of the superpowers. And a very obviously a good example is when you have many op-eds talking about China taking over Hong Kong. It doesn't really have to. It already has Hong Kong, right? So I think the question is, how will it take over, and what it can do in terms of deterring people from intervening. So I think the unintended consequences would be the back way to get around the financial system. I think it will, in the short term, hamper Russia significantly, and then it will get support. But at the same time, China is still depending on the dollar. So a lot of Chinese banks are still avoiding financing oil transactions. And so I think it is, in the short term, not going to be not going to happen. But it is a medium term story rather than a short term story, in my opinion.
Thank you. And then to come back to the question I posed a moment ago, if you had to pick out a single profound impact of the Ukraine war on Asia, what would it be?
Did you?
Is that? Yeah. Sorry. Go.
Sorry, to whom are you asking?
Oh, sorry. I was going to follow up with Ching, but if you have,
Chin. Sorry. Go ahead,
no. If you have an answer ready, please do.
No.
The audience fine.
I defer to Chin.
I would say to hedge your bets on diversification, which is the 101 rule for investment and for anything in life, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. So that can be for any country. Europe is a good example where, if you look at Germany, reliance on gas from Russia, and how can you have economic security and social security when you depend on a partner that you ultimately cannot trust, right? So I think that ranges across the region. That goes into supply chains, that goes into investment, and that, I would say, that's a number one takeaway. Understand your essentials and securing them, and having a diversification, and also worst case scenarios do happen. Right? So you cannot have a rosy outlook of the world and hope. So prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And I think once you have preparation for the worst, and then you can absorb the shocks. So the shocks have come to Asia, right? We have COVID. Let's not forget, because this conversation hasn't talked about it. That was a huge shock, where we have economies crushed, and then that was a sort of war on social welfare, and that always accelerated, I think, the global order. And countries that have done well were the ones that are much more diversified and prepare for the war, right? A good example. And I would say that this is the same shock. So the shocks are the short-term shocks and the medium-term shocks. So when we talk about the short-term shocks of oil costing more, supply chains risk, or we talk about medium-term risk of managing relationships between big powers. So I would say diversification, that's a key takeaway. And of course, everyone's investing more on defense, because you cannot have economic development without security, right? Look at the images that we see of the bombardment of Ukraine. Like, so much for everything that's been worked on to develop that after World War II. And clearly, and defense is going to be, I don't mean to say it as a sector, but very clearly something that is going to be at the forefront. So people are going to start thinking about their Maslow's needs before they start talking about ideals. Right? That's a key takeaway: diversification and essentials.
Thank you, Jing. And Brahma, what's your view? What's the most important impact or lesson for Asia?
I think the most important impact on Asia is likely to be the greater strategic space that China will have to pursue its ambitions because of this US-Russia confrontation. I see China emerging as a clear winner from the US-Russia confrontation. China has the capacity to bail out the Russian economy. The US imperative to win Chinese cooperation on the Western sanctions against Russia gives Beijing important leverage that Beijing will wield like a double-edged sword to extract concessions both from the US and Russia. But China's emergence as a stronger power will have profound implications for Asian security and economy.
Thank you. Huang, the last word falls to you. What's the biggest impact?
Very hard to pick one, but I think, in traditional discussion, we've been thinking about, hard security, military defense, and kinetic war, and we've separated from non-traditional security, pandemic, climate change, or economic insecurity. But I think what this war shows is that there's no separation. Energy security is national security, food security is national security, economic security is national security. And so it's affected everyone, even those who considered themselves far away and similarly not related or involved in the process. The prices of oil and gas have risen. The disruption of supply chain already since the COVID. I think even the consumers and people, civilians are not interested necessarily in international affairs far away, are feeling in their pockets as well, for example, right? Or they can't fly, they now have to fly extra long hours and maybe pay extra money to get from Asia to Europe because airlines avoid Russia. So there are impact on everything, and because we've grown such a globalized world, it's not easily separable. And again, the reminder that cyber and information warfare that also have been happening heavily in this conflict knows no borders, and they're not limited to state actors either. We have Elon Musk providing Starlink. We have companies like Facebook that are also setting norms of information and disinformation. It has been happening even before the war happens, right? US released information that Russia will attack. That's already information warfare happening there. And if Ukraine didn't have connectivity, it wouldn't be able to counter the disinformation that Russia prepared, that President Zelensky escaped the country, right? And that builds into the morale of the Ukrainians and so on and so forth. So I think the takeaway is there's no a defense, military security versus economic or versus other forms of security. Security is a very comprehensive one, and it has all aspects and everything is connected. So that's, I think, key takeaway for those who still consider there are different forms of security out there.
Thank you very much. And we've now unfortunately hit 6:30 p.m. in Tokyo, so it's time to bring the discussion to a close. And I want to thank all of our panelists for a really fantastic and stimulating discussion, packed with ideas that and a lot of thoughts for us all to go away and consider. And I would like also to thank everybody who's tuned in, and particularly those who asked a series of excellent questions, which I've tried to draw on as much as possible in my questions to the panelists. And apologies if I didn't get to your question, but there were very, very many of them indeed. And please do consider taking 5 minutes of your time if you've tuned in to fill out the short survey that my colleagues have posted. So in the future, we can choose topics for these webinars that you're interested in, and to make sure as well that the format is user-friendly. The link is in the chat box and the QR code on the screen. So thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.